Our next guest says the protests in Egypt are the reflection of a perfect storm sweeping the region. Joining us on the phone from Washington, D.C. is Jody Ranck. He's an Islamic and African markets advisor to Ishtirak, which consults on business development in the Middle East. He's lived and worked in North Africa and studied Arabic and Islamic history in Tunisia. Jody, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
A pleasure to be here.
So we've been talking a lot in recent days about food inflation globally. Talk to us about specifically what Egypt has seen and what role that has played in the protests.
Yeah, well, I think in the political changes that we've seen over the last month or so, while they may not be a direct result of food prices and inflation and so forth, these things play a major role in that basically what's happened in most of these regimes over the last 20 or 30 years is that the regimes have sought to sort of buy off the civil society by offering sort of artificially lower prices on food and energy. But now with the global financial crisis, what we see is that their backs are up against the wall, and they can no longer, they either have to run large deficits to support these subsidies that have been growing, given the growing or the inflation rate for world food prices, or increase the prices, which brings people out into the streets. So you have this combination of everything from social media, long simmering problems with torture and surveillance societies, as well as these economic factors that are and sort of the youth bulge, which are driving unrest in all these places.
Do you think when you have this sort of economic backdrop that people protesting feel like they have less to lose? In other words, we recently heard from Wael Ghonim, who gave an interview on Egyptian television, and he talked about the sacrifices that folks there in Cairo have made and that they're willing to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the fact that a small number of individuals have resorted to self-immolations and protest or out of desperation, we see that here's an entire generation that has known nothing but disappointment. And I think the World Bank has figures for Tunisia, and I'd be surprised if they were any better in Egypt, where a year and a half after graduation from college, and you think about the investment governments put in educating their population, but a year and a half after graduation, almost 50% of college graduates are still unemployed. That does not paint a picture of hope.
I mean, how much of that can be pinned on Mubarak and his administration, though, and how much could it potentially change under a different one?
Well, I mean, that's the big. How much of it can be pinned on them? That's a much easier question to answer. In that, if you look at 30% of the Egyptian economy, or 30 to 40%, most people think, is essentially run by the Egyptian military. Mubarak comes from the military, and in fact, in much of Africa, they have this expression, the politics of the belly, meaning if you tie a goat to a stake, it only breaks that. So it's just a small circle of elites that benefit from this economy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of blame pointed at the state. However, changing that is is a much bigger challenge than getting rid of Mubarak.
Right.
So the day after Mubarak goes, you have another set of issues.
Jody, we were talking before about the events in Egypt, and I want to bring in the U.S. side to all of this because I find it interesting. Obama saying that the U.S. will support the transition to democracy in Egypt. What is your view of what the U.S. might do or should do if the Muslim Brotherhood has a role in the democracy and in the system in Egypt?
I think it's a very good question, and I think this is presenting a great opportunity to depart from the way we've done foreign policy in the past, and that most people who follow Egypt and so forth view the Muslim Brotherhood painted as an Islamist party that is a threat to democracy. I think close observers of the Muslim Brotherhood really don't buy that line and have a rather different take on that. And I think this is an example where we can engage with Islamist parties because democracy in the Middle East will have an Islamic component of some shape or form. And rather than kind of put foreign policy within a usual almost Cold War grid, this is an opportunity to think differently about that and engage with Islamist parties that truly want to espouse some kind of democratic politics, which my interpretation is they do.
You know, I'm curious as well what the actual support for the Muslim Brotherhood on the ground is. I mean, I saw one poll commissioned by the Washington Institute on Near East Policy that said that the Muslim Brotherhood approved by just 15% of respondents. Its leaders got about 1% in a presidential straw vote. Now, it's sort of unclear because it's been a banned party, obviously, in Egypt all this time. But what's your sense of the public sentiment towards it?
Most of the polls and analyses I've seen mark that support between 10 and 20%. And then, of course, if they actually did get seats in Parliament and so forth, they'd have to come up with the policies. I think it's a lot easier to be an opposition party, and that may actually inflate support, ironically, in some context. But I think governing is going to be a big challenge for any of these Islamist parties, because beyond the ideology, you're coming up against some really difficult economic and broader political problems. And therefore, I don't think they are a great risk of any of the scenarios I've heard. People, they're very skeptical and they're almost scared of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think this is, like I said, I think it's a great time to engage with these parties and help assist towards democratizing that discourse. There are democratic voices in those parties.
Jody, thank you so much for your time. We are out of time for the moment, but again, thank you for your commentary on what's going on in Egypt. Once again, Jody Ranck, an Islamic and African markets advisor to Ishtirak, talking to us by phone from Washington.